Richard Wagner was one of the greatest artists Europe has ever had, but his person remains controversial to this day. Undoubtedly, his work had a tremendous influence on the music of the 19th and 20th century. His works are still of the greatest relevance today, and his artistic greatness is undisputed, despite glaring character flaws. Who was Richard Wagner, and which places and people influenced his life? A biographical approach to the dazzling artist from Germany. Richard was born in Leipzig as the ninth child. Little today bears witness to his brief time in Leipzig. Historically significant for Bach and Luther, the St. Thomas Church is the only Wagner place in Leipzig that has survived. He was baptized here in 1813 and later received piano and organ lessons from the then St. Thomas cantor during his studies. His father died a few months after his birth from typhoid fever, which was rampant in East Germany after the Napoleonic Wars and the Battle of the Nations. His mother married the poet and actor Ludwig Geyer a little later. Richard had a close bond with his stepfather. For a long time, biographers pondered whether Ludwig was his biological father, which would have been very spicy because of Ludwig's Jewish roots. Today, it is assumed that this was not the case.
After 2 years, the family with 9 children moved to Dresden. Unfortunately, also his stepfather died early when Richard was 8 years old. Because of the financial problems, he had to live with different families, also outside Dresden. The Wagner siblings were very musical, and because of their stepfather's theater activities, Richard and his sibling came in contact with the stage at an early age. The oldest sister, Rosalie, was very talented and supported the family with their fees as an actress. Richard was a curious child and traveled extensively as a teenager. At 13, Wagner visited Prague and fell unhappily in love with the daughter of the music-loving nobleman and acquaintance of the Pachter family, where he was allowed to stay. A year later he repeated his visit, and later he came once again on foot from Dresden, because he had no money for a means of transportation. Many years later he still visited the Pachters, always accompanied by his wife. This palace of the Pachter family still exists, and the beautiful romantic courtyard still charms today. The building is now in the hands of the Boutique Hotel Smetana.
At the age of 16, Richard left Dresden to study in Leipzig. There he heard for the first time Beethoven's Fidelio with the Schröder Devrient. This was, according to him, the deciding factor in his becoming a professional musician. 2 years later, he began his music studies at the University of Leipzig, composed his first works, and became interested in politics. In 1833, he left Leipzig at the age of 20 to gain his first professional experience. After a year as choir director in Würzburg, which his brother and theater director Albert had helped him to obtain, the 21-year-old Wagner became music director in Magdeburg. Right at the beginning of his stay, he met Minna Planner, who had an engagement at the theater as first lover. They began a stormy affair with later engagement and marriage in Königsberg. Wagner's debut as Kapellmeister was with Mozart's Don Giovanni at the Goethe Theater in the spa town of Bad Lauchstädt, where the theater company made a summer guest appearance. Wagner was praised, but the economic situation of the theater was desolate, and after the first season it went bankrupt. When Wagner made his debut there in 1834, The wooden theatre was rotten. The roof had sunk a meter and had to be provisionally supported with stone columns. Richard Wagner stayed in this neat little house at Goethestrasse 14 during his stay at the Goethe Theatre. Minna Planner was also a guest in the same house. Already on the first day, Wagner is said to have ensnared Minna at the window. Wagner's extravagance was already evident in his younger years in Magdeburg, and he was soon helplessly over-indebted. He wrote in a letter, "My small apartment on the Breiteweg had become highly repugnant to me, since I found a court summons nailed to the door every time I returned home. I avoided it entirely from then on." The next year he rehearsed his opera Das Liebesverbot. Already in the second performance happened in front of a small audience, and a wild brawl among the theatre staff forced Wagner to stop the performance. After this failure of his first opera, Minna received an engagement to Königsberg, and Wagner followed her in 1836. His stay in Königsberg and later Riga as a Kapellmeister was stormy and ended with a flight because of the astronomical debts he had accumulated there in a very short time. In 1839 he left Riga in a great hurry for fear of his creditors. His destination was Paris, the Mecca of the opera world, where he wanted to stage his latest work, Rienzi, at the Grand Opera. Wagner and Minna decided to escape to Paris by sea with their dog and were smuggled aboard the Thetis in Königsberg. In the strait between Denmark and Sweden, the ship got into heavy storms. The captain was forced to seek refuge from the strong westerly winds at Sandvike, on the southern coast of Norway. But after a few calm days, an even worse storm broke out, raging for 2 days with towering waves and terrible thunderstorms. And just how accurately Wagner fashioned the libretto after his own experiences is shown by the first appearance of Daland, who anchors in a safe bay during a storm and exclaims, "Sandvike it is, I know the bay very well." It was Wagner's lifelong dream to succeed in Paris. It was almost obsessive how he sought recognition in the European capital of opera. No less than 10 times in the course of his life he spent extended periods in Paris. There, on his first extended visit of almost 2 years, he wanted to stage his Rienzi. Meyerbeer, who was immensely successful in Paris, actively supported him. But Wagner's work was not accepted at the opera. Wagner showed no gratitude to Meyerbeer. Throughout his life, he accused the Jew Meyerbeer of ill will. With the frustration of his Paris failure and hatred of Meyerbeer, anti-Semitism awoke in Wagner. Whenever things went badly for him in life, he shifted the blame to Jews whenever possible. Mendelssohn also felt this later. Wagner wrote entire treatises on Judaism, e.g. Judaism in Music in 1848, and noted in his diary about the Jew, "In nature it is such that wherever there is something to parasitize, the parasite sets in." These words later found fertile ground with Cosima and laid the foundation for the Nazi-friendly Bayreuth in the 1920s and 30s, which spread through Cosima to Winifred.
In Paris, he wrote the libretto for his Dutchman. Since he could not achieve his goal to realize the Rienzi production, he had to sell the Dutchman libretto in order to keep his head above water financially. But this did not prevent him later from continuing to use the libretto for his own purposes. In 1842, he left Paris for Dresden, where he had been promised the premiere of his Rienzi. The performance at the Dresden Court Theatre was an amazing success, and for the first time, the 29-year-old was standing in the limelight of German culture. From Dresden, Richard Wagner visited the castle Wartburg in Eisenach several times. Wagner was fascinated by the legends of the Middle Ages and by the knights and castles of Germany. His next opera was given the double title Tannhäuser and the Minnesinger Contest on the Wartburg. Wagner combined an invented love story of Tannhäuser and his pilgrimage to the Pope with the singers' contest at the castle of the Thuringian Landgrave. Like most of his operas, the theme of this opera is autobiographically charged, and in the main character we recognize many parallels to Wagner's world of thought. An outsider wants to change the traditional rules of art and fails because of society's inertia. This opera, Tannhäuser has a tough time. He is cursed 3 times, first by the Thuringian court, then by the Singers' Guild, and finally even by the Pope. At least salvation comes through Elisabeth. She sacrifices herself for the beloved Tannhäuser. As in The Flying Dutchman, the theme of the sacrifice of the women and the redemption of the artist is a key aspect, and it runs like a thread through Wagner's work. During his work on Tannhäuser, he also had to take care of The Dutchman. Its premiere took place on January 2nd, 1843 at the Royal Court Theatre in Dresden. Wagner himself had the conducting baton in his hand. After the triumphant premiere of Rienzi at the same venue 3 months earlier, Wagner hoped for another success. He was disappointed, however, and the audience received his music extremely lukewarmly, and the production was terminated after 4 performances. Wilhelmine Schröder-Devrient was said to have been an impressive centaur, but the staging and the other singers did not meet Wagner's expectations. The success of The Dutchman would not really take off until the adapted version of the Zurich production of 10 years later. 2 years later, the premiere of Tannhäuser also followed in Dresden. This time, too, the success was moderate, but already the second staging by Liszt in Weimar brought the breakthrough. Tannhäuser became Wagner's most popular opera for a long time and was first performed in the United States as early as 1859. In 1846, a 3-month summer vacation took the Dresden Kapellmeister Richard Wagner to nearby Graupa and Pirna in Saxon Switzerland. Long walks led him to the Liebetaler Grund and to the famous rock formation of the Bastei. Wagner enthusiastically explored the surroundings with his beloved dog Peps and hiked several times to the Liebetaler Grund. The hiking trail leads along the wildly romantic course of the Wesenitz Creek. The experiences in nature and the castles of Germany deeply impressed the 33-year-old composer and encouraged him to delve even deeper into the mythical world of the Nordic culture and spurred his romantic creativity to create his Lohengrin. Wagner, the court opera Kapellmeister, became involved in the revolutionary movement and met the anarchist Bakunin. After 3 days of street fighting in which Wagner took part, he was wanted by the authorities. So Wagner fled to Liszt in Weimar that year, and Liszt generously helped him with shelter and money and promised to perform his Lohengrin, which was planned for Dresden. And thus, in 1850, the Weimar Court Theatre became the premier venue for this romantic opera by the wanted Wagner. Wagner's escape, together with his wife Minna, led him to the protective Switzerland. And his long Zurich exile lasted 10 years, from 1849 to 1859. There he befriended the German industrialist couple Wesendonck, who became his patrons. His stormy love for his patron's wife Mathilde inspired him to write his great love opera Tristan und Isolde. His extramarital relationship with Mathilde served as his inspiration for Tristan. The 20-year-old enchanted the married Richard, and the story that followed is well known. The relationship with Mathilde remained secret, and Wagner always claimed in later years that it remained platonic. In 1854, the 40-year-old Wagner wrote to Liszt that he had never enjoyed the real happiness of love until now, and he now wanted to erect a monument to her. The plot of Tristan und Isolde is symptomatic. Tristan, alias Wagner, and Isolde, alias Mathilde, cannot come together on earth because of Isolde's marriage to King Marke, alias Otto. Wagner was far away from the opera houses of Germany, and the premiere of Tristan was still to be more than 10 years away. He moved into an adjoining house, the so-called Asylum of the Villa Wesendonck, in 1857. This building is now a museum of non-European culture and can be visited. The Asylum no longer stands. Richard Wagner first read from the epic The Ring of the Nibelung to his Swiss friends in 1857. He read the entire Ring on 4 evenings in the ballroom Le Petit Palais of the Noble Hotel Beau-Lac. Later, he also performed the first act of the Walküre in concert. In 1860, Wagner took another run at the Paris Grand Opera, but his artistic fortunes in Paris were never to recover from the coming event at the Grand Opera. What happened in this fateful year? In order to promote familiarity with his works, Wagner had conducted 3 concerts of excerpts from various of his operas at the beginning of 1860. Among the audience were all the musical celebrities of Paris at the time, such as Berlioz, Rossini, Meyerbeer, Auber, and Gounod. The response was extraordinary, and Wagner, with the help of the wife of the Austrian ambassador, managed to get Napoleon III to order the performance of Tannhäuser the following year. What happened in 1861 went down in the annals of opera history. Wagner adapted the work to the conventions of the Grand Opera. Among other things, the Bacchanal of the first movement was expanded with a ballad, and a French language libretto was created. Wagner personally staged the opera, taking 164 rehearsals to prepare the sometimes overworked musical staff. But the performances turned into a fiasco. The Jockey Club, a larger group of dandies, sabotaged the performances because they were accustomed to appearing only in the second act, when their mistresses danced in the usual ballet. Wagner, however, had placed the ballet in the first act for scenic reasons. In protest, they unpacked whistles during the performance and interrupted the play with noise and heckling. Deeply hurt and heavily in debt, Wagner ended the Paris adventure after 3 performances. Wagner now tried his luck in Vienna. Already at the age of 19, his first great journey had brought him to the city on the Danube. There he was able to celebrate great triumphs with Lohengrin and Tannhäuser. But in Vienna he also suffered one of the greatest humiliations of his life. He had hoped to solve his financial problems after the fiasco in Paris with the performances of the just completed Tristan. But one European capital after the other had refused the performance. The last hope of the heavily indebted Wagner was Vienna. During this time, he lived for several months in an apartment in the Hadiggasse in very luxurious conditions, which, as usual, he could not afford. As always, he furnished his apartment with sinfully expensive furnishings. He worked there on his Master Singers of Nuremberg. The story of this opera is the contest of the Meistersingers, who vie for the hand of the beautiful daughter of one of the Meistersingers. The state, aging Sixtus Beckmesser, applies, but subsequently makes a mockery of himself. Wagner originally called the character of the Mörker Hans Lick, referring to the feared Viennese music critic Hans Lick. Years before, the latter had been fond of Wagner in his early years and was one of the first to write a sympathetic review of the freshly published Tannhäuser in 1845. He subsequently gained the composer's trust, and in the same year he had insight into the first sketches of the Meistersinger. Later, he turned away from Wagner's music and wrote bitter words about the Lohengrin, poverty of musical thought, or the Tristan, the systemized non-music. Maliciously, Wagner invited the critic during this stay in Vienna in 1862 when he read the complete poetry of the Meistersinger for the first time in a small circle. Hans Lick understood the allusion. The character was still called Hans Lick there, and he became, in the aftermath of these events, and as a revenge, a fierce spokesman for the conservatives around Brahms, to a powerful adversary against the New Germans around Wagner. Back to Tristan. In the Viennese court opera, work on the performance of Tristan began, but after many months, 77 rehearsals and more promissory notes later, all efforts were in vain. The work was unperformable. The singers were hopelessly overtaxed, was the verdict of those involved. Without the income from a performance, he was threatened with prison because of his debts. Before he was thrown into the Viennese debtors' prison to force payments to his creditors, he allegedly fled the city in women's clothes, which thus became one of the greatest ignominies of his life and led to his greatest life crisis. After his departure, he wrote to a Viennese friend, "Good, truly helpful miracle must happen to me now, otherwise it is over." Richard Wagner was now completely destitute. What he didn't know was that in 1861 the Bavarian king Ludwig II had left the Munich theatre deeply moved and in tears after a performance of Lohengrin. When Ludwig called Wagner to Munich in this fateful year of 1864, he rescued the composer from his greatest life crisis. With his royal casket, he made possible the first performance of Tristan in Munich, and this moment meant the most glorious event of Wagner's work in Munich. Ludwig had the power and the means to order a performance in Munich that had failed in Vienna. This succeeded with the help of the conductor Hans von Bülow and the gifted singer couple von Carolsfeld, who together managed to a production of Tristan on its feet. Today, the Munich National Theatre is home to the Bavarian State Opera. It became the premier venue not only of the opera Tristan und Isolde, but also of the Meistersinger, the Valkyrie and the Rheingold. The impact of Tristan on European music was tremendous and immediate. The premiere took place on June 21, 1868, in the presence of the king, and Wagner received one of the greatest ovations of his life, when he was allowed to accept the applause in the king's box. In doing so, he violated court etiquette when he stepped forward and bowed there, which was reserved only for the king. But the king stood blissfully 2 steps behind him, and still in the morning hours he wrote a letter of homage to the master. The work itself found a huge echo, and began to radiate throughout the continent, although the next production would not take place until 9 years later in Bayreuth. Ludwig thus became his patron, but Wagner's exorbitant demands placed an excessive burden on the Bavarian king's treasury, and Wagner had to leave Munich in 1865 after only 1 year, against the king's will, under pressure from the royal government. But Wagner's operas were the greatest experience of Ludwig's life. He immersed himself in Wagner's world of legend and had Neuschwanstein built. The king remained faithful to Wagner over the many years, despite the many monstrosities of Wagner, who lied and then deceived him over many years. Let us return to the Munich premiere of Tristan. It had its spicy sides. The conductor von Bülow was rehearsing in close collaboration with Wagner. However, his relationship with the composer was more than strained, because Wagner had stolen his wife Cosima from him years before. Von Bülow suffered greatly from this, but it did not diminish his artistic esteem for Wagner. At the time of the rehearsals for the premiere of Tristan, Cosima already had 2 children by each of the 2 men, but was officially still together with Bülow. However, because Wagner did not want to be without Cosima in Munich and the appearance of marriage had to be maintained, the 3 lived under one roof for months. Wagner was a womanizer. Women were attracted to the romantic, understanding man. His loves became his muse, and the muse became the characters of his operas. Minna became Senta, Mathilde became Isolde, the stern Cosima became the bitchy Fricka. Like Wotan, Wagner was not averse to cheating. On the contrary, it was his lifelong habit and elixir. In addition to adultery, he was not afraid to take the wives of his patrons and friends. Hans von Bülow and Otto von Wesendonck had to experience it. Cosima too was repeatedly a victim of Richard's romantic escapades. Vreneli Weidmann was Wagner's servant for 10 years during his Swiss years. The unmarried Vreneli named her first child Wilhelm Richard. It strongly resembled Wagner, and Richard maintained a cordial relationship with him. The next 2 children that Vreneli bore were also the spitting image of Richard. His relationship with Carrie Pringle, the last love affair of his life, also had it all. Wagner discovered her in 1881 as a flower girl in Parsifal. As always, Cosima looked the other way when he flirted with her. When the terminally ill Wagner let her come on vacation to Venice under the pretext of an audition, even Cosima lost her temper and a terrible quarrel broke out between the 2. A few hours later, Wagner died on a heart attack. Expelled by the Munich government, Ludwig financed Wagner's asylum on the southern edge of Lucerne. Wagner lived there with his wife Cosima from 1866 to 1872. Cosima gave Richard 3 children together: Siegfried, Eva and Daniela. Also living with the Wagners were the 2 children Isolde and Blandine, who were from Cosima's marriage to von Bülow. Wagner received many guests in Lucerne. The young Friedrich Nietzsche, then professor at the University of Basel, frequently visited the Wagners, and Ludwig also paid his respects to the master incognito. It was him who financed Wagner's princely asylum in Triebschen. The stately home is majestically situated on Lake Lucerne. It was acquired by the city of Lucerne in 1931 and became a Richard Wagner museum worth seeing. In particular, the Erar Grand, which accompanied him everywhere, found its way back to this Wagner place with the opening of the museum. It was in this house that the first performance of the Siegfried Idyll took place in 1870, which he gave to his wife on her birthday morning with 15 musicians in the stairwell of the villa. Wagner's lifelong dream was to build his own festival house, where he could realize the Gesamtkunstwerk, the total work of art, merging of the arts of music, architecture, theater and stage design, as he planned for his Ring of the Nibelungs. He chose this provincial town to give maximum attention to the performances during the festival, without the distractions of a big city. It was clear to Wagner from the beginning that the performance of such a work as the Ring of the Nibelungs was hardly possible in the existing theatre landscape. 20 years before, he had started his work on the Ring, and it was to take another 5 years before it was completed. Securing the financing for this enormous undertaking cost Wagner a lot of work. In 1872, he moved to Bayreuth with his wife Cosima, and construction work began. Together with many patrons, he succeeded in raising money for the laying of the foundation stone for the Festspielhaus and for his new home, the Villa Wahnfried. Raising the capital to finance the Festspielhaus was slow going, and he had to travel a lot, giving lectures and conducting. This put a great strain on him, and his heart was badly affected. Once again, Ludwig helped him out of a jam with a considerable amount of money. In the meantime, Wagner had gathered a group of young artists around him, who helped him with various works. One of the prominent members was Engelbert Humperdinck, the later creator of the opera Hansel and Gretel. 4 years later, the Festspielhaus was opened with the Rheingold. The first festival took place in 1876 in the presence of Emperor Wilhelm and all the European cultural celebrities, and became Wagner's greatest triumph. However, this first festival became a financial fiasco. After that, it took 6 years until the next festival in 1882, where Wagner premiered his last work, Parsifal. Moments of the Ring cycle and the construction of the Festspielhaus, Wagner had completed his vision of the Gesamtkunstwerk. The festival house still impresses today with its excellent acoustics, the excellent view of the stage and the concealed orchestra pit. The winters in Bayreuth were very cold and foggy. Wagner escaped them by regular trips to the south. A visit to Ravello on the Amalfi coast in the garden of Palazzo Ruffolo inspired him to create Klingsor's garden for his last opera, Parsifal. Wagner visited Venice half a dozen times. He often stayed briefly at the Danieli and then moved to another place. In the winter of 82-83, the Wagner family spent several months in the Lagoon City. Wagner was in poor health and died of a heart attack at Palazzo Vendramin on February 13, 1883. His body was transported from Venice in a funeral gondola, and the funeral took place in the garden of the Villa Wahnfried. After Richard's death, Cosima Wagner took over as director of the festival. She led the clan with an iron hand and succeeded in institutionalizing festival internationally. At the same time, she openly sympathized with right-wing extremist ideas. Siegfried took over responsibility for the festival from Cosima in 1901. He was able to reopen the festival after World War I despite severe financial problems, and despite his homosexuality, he married the English woman Winifred Williams, who established a close relationship with Hitler and ran the festival during the Nazi years after Siegfried's death. Siegfried died just 4 months after Cosima from a heart attack he had suffered at rehearsals of Tannhäuser. Winifred and Siegfried had 4 children, among them Wieland and Wolfgang, who took over the direction of the festival after the war. Eva became Cosima's confidante. She married Houston Chamberlain, who consistently carried on the Wagner family's anti-Semitic sentiments. To this day, the Bayreuth Festival is a pilgrimage site for friends of Richard Wagner's music.